Why do more and more mobile CMOS image sensors support on-chip HDRI features?
So, I mean, there is strong demand for better and better image quality on smartphones for consumer applications, right? So, one way you can do HDR imaging is the traditional way where you capture a bunch of images and then you apply some post-processing algorithm that could run on your, smartphone using the CPU or the RAM on your phone. But there are several downsides to doing this kind of traditional post-processing approach. Well, one is latency, because if you're doing it in post-processing, you're paying the extra penalty of transferring the image data over to either your cell phone memory or some intermediate processing compute module, which does the HDR algorithm. The other downside is noise. Well, it's always advantageous to run your algorithms as close to the image sensor in the native data format as possible, because all the subsequent steps you apply to it will introduce some noise and some artifacts in that signal processing chain. The third downside to doing this post-processing approach is that you won't be able to deal with motion artifacts. If this also connects back to the latency issue, where if something in the scene has moved while you're capturing these multiple images, if you're not running the HDR algorithm fast enough, if your frames are captured after too much of a delay, then you'll have to deal with that motion in post-processing, and that is often very difficult to do. Then you'll have to live with some motion artifacts like ghosting in your final HDR image, and that is increasingly not acceptable even to an average consumer these days, right? We have all gotten used to very good image quality on our phones. So I think this is the main reason why many of the image sensor manufacturers are now pushing towards implementing these HDR features as close to the image sensor as possible. And this is, I guess it's not a very new trend, because if you trace back pixel designs where you had a finite full well capacity, but then the overflow charge used to be captured in like a bucket on the side, that has been around since like the early 2000s. And then more recently, there are these rolling shutter sensors where they use some kind of interlacing schemes where different rows use different exposure settings when the data is being captured. And then the post-processing HDR algorithm is able to generate a single high dynamic range image while accounting for those exposure setting variations between either the different rows or different groups of pixels on your image sensor and so on. In the end, it's just making sure that there are no other motion or ghosting artifacts, because all of that data was captured simultaneously at the same time with respect to the scene, right? So at the end of the day, all of these techniques are just making a trade-off, right? The trade-off is between the final spatial resolution that you can get and the dynamic range.
In the future, will the processing of computational photography be completed by image sensors on-chip ISP or by independent APs?
For HDR, or even in general for any computational photography algorithm, right? You can imagine implementing it in a few different ways. You could either implement it as purely post-processing, where you capture all the image data and then you deal with it later on, maybe even as late as running it on your on the processing unit and the RAM of your smartphone. Or you could run it on the extreme end, where you start processing the data as soon as the light is hitting the sensor. You do some in-pixel processing, as they call it. So these are the two extremes, and then there is everything in between, right? Now, in general, I believe the closer you move your processing to the image sensor, there are some advantages to it, because then you can process things much faster. So there's low latency in general, and it is more robust to deal with noise and motion and other image artifacts when you deal with that information in the native raw data domain, which is as close to the image sensor as possible. But then there is a downside where you lose some amount of flexibility, right? So let's say tomorrow I want to release some other finely tuned, optimized algorithm for HDR. It's way easier for me to do that if it's implemented later in the signal processing chain, right? It's much easier to send someone an update for their app than having them to do like a firmware update that has to change some low-level code in their ISP or AP. So I think many computational photography algorithms, including HDR, have become so standard that I think most people would just consider many of these as just default settings on their smartphones. And so for such algorithms, it does make sense to implement them in an on-chip ISP in a very heavily optimized way. And then once it's there, you don't really have to touch it or change it that much. So the final answer to your question, I mean, that dichotomy between ISPs or these independent application processors, I think that the devil is in the detail there, because there may be many application specific requirements and many different trade-offs that you'll have to consider on a case-by-case basis. And it may make sense to implement that on a dedicated ISP that just does one thing and does it really well. Or it may make sense to have a bit of flexibility and then you run it on an application specific processor where HDR is not the only thing it does. It does many other things.